Hi everyone, and we are back with a new episode of APIM Hotrod. I'm here with Stefan. Stefan, how are you doing?
Hey Massimo, fine and you? What's up?
Very, very good. We
Good.
are very close to Christmas holidays. So I'm feeling the Christmas mood coming up.
Yeah,
Voila, everything is perfect.
good. What are we going to talk about today, Massimo?
Okay, yes. So today we are going to talk about how to expose a shared API management instance to the outside world. Hmm? And in order to do this, Stefan, let's bring back some screen and use some visuals to facilitate this discussion.
Yeah,
Okay?
indeed. Perfect. So then indeed, we often focus on API management itself, right? So how you organize APIs, if you have multiple APIs from different business domains and so on. We already discussed that a bit in the one of the other episodes where we introduced the workspaces, and that's a way to chunk your API gateway or your API management instance into different, let's say, business domains or subdomains. You, of course, have the API suffixes that you can use. You can use products and so on. So you have, let's say, a mix of options that are available. But then once you put the governance in place for your for API management itself, how do you expose this to the outside world? Right. That's a bit the topic of today. And it means that because today, although technically speaking, APIM can be shared directly or exposed directly to internet, it's often not the case anymore, right? Often you have like a front door or an application gateway in front. So you have a web application firewall, let's say, in front of your domain. And so here, what I'll explain a bit today is how do you share a shared APIM to the outside world, but also using, let's say, a private APIM, so meaning completely in this case, that would be the premium feature, for instance, completely inside of a VNet. So that's anyway not reachable from outside. So you need to expose it in any case, right?
And
So that's a
that's
bit, yeah. Tell me,
And that's
Massimo.
so we are focusing on this because it's the most common enterprise setup with isolation and network integration that we see in let's say at least in my case the 98% of the times, right?
Indeed, yeah, indeed. So nowadays, I would say only really smallest companies would still expose APIM directly, but most of the times, indeed, in the enterprise world, you have a WAF before and APIM fully private. So,
Okay.
and here basically that's one way. So there could be, there are multiple options. It's not exhaustive here, but this is the most common. So either you say, okay, you've got, I will try to zoom in a bit to make sure it's big enough. I already chunked this in three, let's say, layers. DNS, because of course you're, let's say, sharing to outside world, so people need to know how to connect to your APIs. Then here I use application gateway. So then we have the application gateway layer with the built-in components of application gateway, and then of course we have APIM itself. So basically, if you have a single domain, so meaning you would, for instance, expose all your APIs through, for instance, in this case, apis.silverit.com, and then it's a single domain for all your consumers, whatever API is actually targeted. Then, okay, you have a single DNS record, right? That would be on this domain because you have a single FUDN in this case. You have a certificate that would be used for the domain. And then, of course, on the shared application gateway, which is also shared typically, you would have a basic listener that's good enough to do that with the certificate of that domain. And then you have a rule in application gateway that will glue together the basic listener and the backend pool and backend settings. And of course, backend pool, backend settings will target the private VIP, so the private virtual IP of your API management instance. And then, of course, how do you segregate a subdomain from another? You can use, as I said, workspaces and so on. You can use API suffixes. So, for instance, say, okay, um, if it's a single domain, then for a single business domain, you would just have your APIs one, two, and whatever is behind. But you could also have like an API suffix like this, and then of course have APIs belonging to this one behind the same. And so you have basically different ways to split, let's say, traffic and split APIs, organize APIs, let's say against single domain. So there are pros and cons to this approach. Pros is that but you have a single certificate because it's a single domain. So in terms of certificate management, it's easy. It's also cheaper because then you have to pay. Typically, such certificates need to be signed by your certificate authority, like right, DigiCert, Global Sign, and so on. You name it, but you have to pay for this, right? Then, of course, you have a single listener, single backend pool, so it's very easy setup. Now, of course, if you need to revoke a certificate, for instance, for security reasons, or if there is a certificate compromise, then of course all the APIs that are behind this domain will be impacted by this security issue. So that can be an issue. And so, of course, how could you compromise certificate this way? But if you grab this private key, right, with the password, and you manage, it's already advanced and sophisticated attacks, but you manage to grab this and, for instance, run a man-in-the-middle attack. So being able, for instance, to introduce you here, right? So typically you would redirect the clients to your own server, let's say, using that info that you stole, instead of going to the actual, the genuine setup. Okay, so that's, of course, not so easy to do, but that's a real technical risk. So, clear on that one, Massimo? Any comment, question on this?
Yeah, I have one question, but
Yeah,
I think that is better that I ask on the next one. So,
yeah.
so far so
Okay,
good.
good.
Very, very clear.
Perfect. So let's go to a domain split approach. So here I'll first focus on diagram before the pros and cons a bit. So here, for instance, say that I've got two APIs and I really have two different FQDNs. So it's really two different domains in this case, right? API1.silverIT.com, API2. So, and that's really my let's say host header. And so I want to have like then a certificate per API that I consume. So in this case, of course, then I would have in application gateway two different listeners, right? One for the API1, one for the API2, each with their own certificate. And of course, each with their own rule and each with the backend pool and backend settings, all still, let's say, going to the same private VIP because that's the entry point of APIM. So independently of what you do in APIM itself, the backend pool will typically be that private VIP. Of course, it could be the host name as well of APIM, but that will be the same. So, and then of course here there are pros and cons. So if we look at this one, then the risk of course is minimal, right? Because if no you compromise one certificate, only this domain will be impacted by this and nothing else. So also in terms of certificate revocation, it's going to be then easier because then not all your APIs that are hosted on that APIM will be impacted. But of course, it's a management burden in terms of certificate because you need to then manage all those certificates. Typically, you need to renew them and so on. And it's of course also much costlier because you have to pay for each of them. That's really dedicated in this case, right? So so that's, let's say, a more not extreme approach, but it depends really on the organization you work for. Yeah? So typically in security-driven organization, they would prefer this just for the fact that a single certificate can be cannot lead to, let's say, make a lot of APIs at risk. Yeah? But then, of course, that could still be, difficult, of course. And here, when I said API 1, I should have maybe put subdomain 1 or subdomain 2 anyway. And then with that, you can still have the granularity of having, let's say, the API suffix and then still ventilate your APIs behind this. So,
So
and
in this
then, yeah,
case, so
yeah,
sorry, because you
no,
said
go
this
ahead.
question, but the first one is more relevant now.
Yeah,
Here, because you are having, so we are using two different FQDN. So
yeah,
suppose a Silver IT1, Silver
yeah,
IT2, or in this case API1, API2. On so there will be sort of rewriting in application gateway, or pointing to a different subfix on API management, like API 1 and API 2, because at the bottom, I mean, on the right of this screen, it will be the same API management, so slash API 1
yeah,
slash API 2.
yeah.
So there is a need of rerouting in the center, right?
Well, actually, you don't really need to write anything yourself because here the DNS they will all target the public IP that is associated to the front-end IP of your application gateway, and because application gateway has dedicated listeners per FQDN, it will be able to figure out itself that you are targeting this one, and because all in the end will target the same APIM, same again, that's not going to be an issue. So typically you would because that's the VIP, right? And so,
Mhm.
and even if you would replace the host name with APIM's host name, that's fine too. And so you don't need to write any rewrite rule for this to work. So of
Yeah,
course,
but
what
what
you,
I'm saying,
yeah,
if
yeah,
you sorry, my question was not clear,
yeah,
Stefan.
mhm,
So I'm my bad. So suppose that you want that API one
mhm,
goes on API management to something that is slash API one, and API two goes on slash API two.
yeah.
Is something that this configuration is in the backend pool, backend settings, right? So it's a sort of there.
Well, even not. Actually, that's really what makes the difference. The listener,
Okay.
you see, because in the listener, so you have one dedicated listener in App Gateway that is then a component of App Gateway with the FQDN, right? And so, and then of course, and it will glue, let's say, the listener, the rule will glue the listener to the backend pool, backend settings. And here you will anyway always go here. The only difference is that, of course, because you have a dedicated backend pool, backend settings, you can probe that differently. So you could, for instance, expose this endpoint with a custom, for instance, monitoring endpoint that would only be for your API. And so, but you don't need to write anything special because on APIM itself, it will always let's say all of that will in the end up to the same VIP, right? And then you need to and of course the APIs are ventilated across different API suffixes and so on. So for APIM it will see traffic coming, it does not know that it's coming from this or this, it will just look at what is behind. So if you would say here indeed, so to make it more clear, if you would say here APIs and then something, right, then APIM will just look at that part. If you
Yeah,
specify
exactly.
some,
Okay.
yeah, but
We are on the
that's
same page. What
yeah,
I meant is because we call it API one here and API two. I thought that API one was what you put now the AAA, and then it requires a
yeah,
redirect.
no. Actually, here, but that's a bit my fault. I should have been more clear. Here, that could have been, for instance, HR just saying
Exactly, the
APIs.
department.
I understand it's a bit confusing. So you could have, and then behind this, you could have had like
Okay.
the HR API suffixes and then the APIs. You see, or whatever you
Yeah.
want. So it's just if you want to use different subdomains, basically, right? In fact, not subdomains, domains. Yeah? Then this way of working offers a good granularity. Sorry, I will try to put it back. Yeah, I will make it. But of course, it has also some drawbacks. And so no rewrite will required and so on. Plain
Yeah.
configuration that it really happens at this stage by splitting the listeners. Basically, that's
Okay.
mostly, and of
That's
course
okay.
DNS. Yeah? And so, but here, okay, you have everything that's dedicated per FQDN, basically. And then, of course, the one of the benefits is that then you can have a custom probe per FQDN as well, because we tackled that in another episode as well. But APIM itself exposes a monitoring endpoint, right? It's like status A, B, C, E, F, something like that. But that will always, as long as APIM is healthy, it will always return a healthy state. But maybe the API that you're exposing is actually itself not healthy. So you see, so sometimes you'd better actually probe your own endpoint that you really specifically crafted for monitoring than just probing APIM's one, because APIM's does not know if the APIs that are targeted by consumers are themselves healthy or not. So in this setup, then you can of course have a tailor-made probing for per FQDN, let's say, which can be interesting. And then you have, let's say, the third option. You can also mix a combination of these options, but let's say here it's another example where you would have still different, but in this case, really different APIs, right? Same case as before, but instead of using a basic listener, you can use a multi-site listener. And then when you have a multi-site listener, you have two options. Either you use a wildcard certificate, but that's typically not liked by CISO teams, right? By security teams. For again the compromise reason, if that the certificate is stolen and so on, then all the domains that are behind will be compromised, and it's even worse than all the domains that you use here. It's all the domains that would be subdomains of this one, right? So meaning that I could even create a new domain that you don't even know, and then with my DNS I send you, and then if I manage to wildcard to steal the wildcard certificate, then of course I can even create a new domain for your organization you don't even know about it. Yeah. So it could really be dangerous, this one. So but okay, that exists. It's a possibility. So wildcard, in this case, you just put anything you want in front here. That will be resolved, let's say, by this wildcard certificate. And then, of course, a single backend pool and backend settings. And the alternative is still to use a multi-site listener, but in this case, with what is called SAN and SNI, so server name integrations, and where you can specify one common domain, for instance, name, the primary domain, and then alternative, let's say, domains. In this case, so host names. So in this case, this would work with a single certificate. So you still have a higher risk in terms of certificate compromise than the previous option, but it's limited to the list of hosts that you have here, right? While of course this one, if you have the wildcard, sky is the limit. And then, of course, same behind it will target the VIP, so of your APIM. In those cases, anyway, all hands up in APIM, and then, of course, you split APIs, you organize them as you see fit, according to your APIM governance. But here it's more really what happens before you reach APIM. And so here, pros and cons. But wildcard certificate, of course, that's, let's say, the option. So you have to use a multi-site listener, and then of course you have a common probe as well, right? As soon as you have one listener, then typically you have one backend pool, one backend settings, and then of course let's say a common probe. So same as I explained, so certificate revocation can be a challenge, and of course for both wildcard and SAN, and then of course single certificate compromise risks that I've just explained. But of course the impacts are higher if you use a wildcard. No, I would say again that depends. Typically in security-driven organization, this option would be discarded. But of course, it depends on the risk appetite. So it depends on many different things before to choose whether or not you go for this option. SAN SNI is quite common, so that could be something an interesting option.
Okay,
So these are the three I see, Massimo. Could be
very
others,
cool.
but it's typically one of those three or combination.
Yes, I'm more for the second, the domain split, because on the wildcard, I agree with you. It's really, I mean, most of the time is the CISO that show the red card, but if not, I'm not big a fan of wildcard
Wild cards,
certificate.
yeah.
But okay,
Indeed.
it depends. It's a personal
But it
preference.
depends on the maturity of the PKI team, and that's not always so easy actually, because
Yeah,
of course you need
actually,
the
it's the easy approach, the wildcard certificate, right? Or we could say
that's
that
why,
is the
yeah. So
most
often,
common because it
people
comes with
would look
less
for
challenges.
simplicity, so they said, "Ah, okay, I've got a wild card, so sky's the limit. I can do whatever I want," which is indeed true. But then, of course, there are risks associated to this freedom. And so, again, that depends on the processes you have inside the company and so on. But yeah, that's often this one that you could see,
Yeah.
which is the most secure, but also the costliest in terms of
Yes.
certificates, right? Because you have to pay for all these certificates as well.
I have two questions
Yeah,
before closing these episodes. And one of these questions is a little bit off topic, but okay, let's go ahead with this. So I
yeah,
will start with the one on topic. So here, I think you already mentioned here is we are showing application gateway, but the same setup is valid also for Azure Front Door that
yeah,
use the same
indeed.
approach. Just I'm asking to confirm.
It's indeed the case. Of course, the internal components of Frondora are named differently, but the principles are the same. Yes, indeed.
Okay. And the second curiosity, because you mentioned those certificate for SSL, TLS, so the one that we have on the list for the DNS.
Yeah.
I have this off-topic question, really off-topic.
Mhm.
So when you have MTLS, so let's say
Mhm.
client certification, in this kind of setup, should I do this client certification validation at application gateway side, at API management side? Do you see any challenges with client certificate?
There are some. I would say application gateway. Typically, the sooner you can validate something, the better. So that you don't let an illegal request go further. So application gateway has indeed a built-in MTLS, let's say, validation process. There is one challenge though with this is that you don't have CLR checks. Sorry, not easy to say with application gateway. So it's only compliant with OSSP. So meaning that, but depending again on the PKI and so that is in use, it could be an issue, right? Because CLR check is not available, right? So that's one of the challenge that I would say. And then of course, what you see sometimes elsewhere as well is that even non-Azure WAFs, of course, are used, right? So I will not advertise, and it's not to make any advertising, but we have, for instance, things like Imperva, Barracuda, and so on and so on. And so basically, these often still have the CLR check. So CLR is more kind of legacy now, but it's still heavily used. So that's one challenge of MPLS with, let's say, application gateway is that. But it's not there out of the box. So you can always try to extract the certificate, add some custom headers, send that to the backend. But then if the backend has to do it, the validation, it's not ideal. Hence, of course, you also have the client certificates for performed by Azure itself, by the API management itself. But there again, if you don't expose directly the, let's say, APIM, then you'd better do it here, right, at the level of the WAF. Hence, of course, worst case, you can always let it go, but then you still need to make sure that the WAF forwards the certificate because it's not all, it's not especially out of the box. So you need to typically rewrite a rule to make sure that this is, forwarded and being sent to the, let's say,
The
validation.
downstream service, yeah. Okay, perfect. So we are at the end of our episode. So
Yeah.
thank you, Stefan, for
Thank you, Massimo.
explanation today, and thank you for everyone who's watching this episode.
Yeah,
So
perfect.
voila, that's everything for today.
Yes, see you. Bye bye. Next time, Massimo. Bye.